The story begins inside a royal palace, where a young boy named Van suddenly wakes up in a large, luxurious bed. When he raises his hands, he is immediately confused. His hands are small, thin, and clearly not those of an adult. At the same time, memories from another life begin to surface. He remembers living in Japan, spending his days packed into crowded trains, working endlessly, and returning home exhausted every night. His life back then was repetitive and empty. Realizing what has happened, Van understands that he has been reincarnated into another world. Van climbs out of bed and uses a small stool to look out the window. Outside, he sees wide land, tall buildings, and a peaceful sky. Before he can enjoy the view for long, his maid, Till, rushes in and panics, warning him that it is dangerous. When Van calmly apologizes using clear and polite words, Till freezes in shock. Van is supposed to be only 2 years old. Hearing himself speak, Van realizes that along with memories from his past life, he also has memories from this world. His name is Van Ne Ferdio, son of Marquis Jalpa Ferdio, ruler of this land. Later, Van sits down for breakfast with his father and brothers. The atmosphere is stiff and quiet. Jalpa asks his sons what they plan to study that day. Jard says he will focus on fire magic and battle formations, while Sesto says he will study magic. When Jalpa turns to Van, Van answers honestly, saying he wants to learn the nation's history and culture first. His answer shocks his brothers, but Jalpa laughs and praises Van's intelligence. He confidently states that Van will inherit powerful fire magic, just like his parents, and tells him to look forward to his magical aptitude test when he turns 8. Van soon learns that magic determines a person's value in this world. Fire, water, wind, and earth are considered noble elements, while all other magic types are treated as useless. After breakfast, Van begins studying the world's structure, races, and magic tools. However, things become intense when the strict head butler Espada takes over his education. Espada pushes Van into merciless study sessions from morning until night. Thanks to this harsh training, Van learns to read and write within weeks, though he often wonders how this is considered normal for a toddler. After 2 years of non-stop studying, Van turns 4 and begins sword training. At first, he is completely hopeless and loses repeatedly, even to the maids. Still, he refuses to quit and continues practicing every day. By the time he turns 5, his effort pays off. He starts defeating older trainees with ease, thanks to his calm thinking and experience from his past life. Unlike his brothers, Van treats commoners kindly, which earns him respect and friendship. During training, the deputy knight commander D examines Van's hands and notices that they lack calluses. He realizes that Van spends more time studying than training. D offers to speak to Espada, but instead decides to personally train Van himself. Unfortunately, D's idea of training is extreme, pushing Van to his physical limits with no mercy. Still, Van cannot deny that despite the pain, he feels fulfilled for the first time in his life. By the time Van turns 6, the endless routine of studying and training becomes exhausting. Wanting to actually enjoy life, Van decides to act like a normal child and asked to visit the market. The market is lively and full of people, and Van is fascinated by everything he sees. While exploring, he witnesses a shocking scene, a man selling his own son into slavery. Van learns that poor families often sell children they cannot support. When the man becomes violent after learning his son is worth very little, Van steps in and buys the boy for 5 silver coins. Van never planned to own him and told him he is free. However, since Kamsin has nowhere to go, Van registers him as his slave so he can safely bring him home. A slave contract is formed, leaving a mark on Kamsin's hand. Time passes, and Van finally reaches 8 years old, the age when magical aptitude is tested. Everyone expects him to awaken powerful elemental magic. Instead, the result leaves everyone stunned. Van possesses production magic, a type considered worthless. Furious, Jalpa nearly kill him on the spot. At the last moment, Van's eldest brother, Mercia, intervenes and suggests sending Van to govern a remote village instead. Jalpa agrees and orders Van to leave immediately. Though cast aside, Van feels hopeful about starting a new life. However, his hope quickly fades when Espada and Dee announce that they will accompany him. Van continues his journey toward his assigned territory in a carriage. To pass the time, he decides to experiment with his production magic. Concentrating his mana, he creates a small sword out of thin air. The process goes smoothly, showing that he already has excellent control over his magic. Kamsin watches quietly and is not surprised, as he already knows Van learns incredibly fast. During the ride, Van brings up an important issue. Since he has been disowned by his family and lost his noble status, he tells Kamsin that there is no longer any reason for him to remain a slave. Van offers to cancel the slave contract and help him live freely. However, Kamsin immediately refuses. He firmly declares that his life now belongs to Van and that he will follow him wherever he goes. Van is troubled by how serious Kamsin is, but accepts his decision. Suddenly, the carriage stops. Looking ahead, they see a village under attack. Dee quickly evaluates the situation and estimates around 50 enemies, likely bandits. He suggests attacking immediately. However, the adventurer Ortho objects, reminding everyone that their contract is only to escort Van, not fight a full battle. Dee becomes angry and insists he cannot abandon innocent villagers. Even if no one helps him, he is ready to fight alone. Before things escalate, Espada intervenes and bluntly calls Dee's plan reckless. Instead, Espada proposes a strategy using a defensive wall, ranged attacks, and a surprise flank assault. Van immediately notices the flaw in the plan. Espada would have to act as bait, putting his life at risk. Understanding how important Espada and Dee are to the future of the territory, Van volunteers to take the role himself. Till and Kamsin panic and strongly object, but Van calmly insists. He reminds them that he trained with the sword for years and believes this is something he must do. Van's resolve deeply affects Ortho, who recalled how politely Van thanked him earlier. Realizing Van is different from other nobles, Ortho steps forward and refuses to let a child risk his life. With that, the plan is revised. Espada raises the defensive wall, adventurers fire arrows from behind it, and Dee and Ortho's forces launch a coordinated attack from both sides. The bandits fall into chaos. During the battle, the bandit leader breaks through and charges towards the wall, but Van steps in and slashes his Achilles tendon. Kamsin immediately finishes the fight. The remaining bandits are captured and the village is saved, without civilian casualties. After the battle, most adventurers leave, but Ortho and his party decide to stay behind, impressed by Van's leadership and calm judgment. Van then formally introduces himself to the village chief, Rhonda, as their new lord. Rhonda explains that the village has suffered repeated attacks ever since night patrols stopped coming. Van apologizes for the neglect and promises to protect them. He presents 3 possible plans: creating valuable goods, hiring mercenaries, or strengthening the village's defenses. The villagers are unsure until Espada and Dee introduce themselves and reveal their positions. Hearing this greatly boosts morale. Van then shocks everyone by lowering the tax rate from 30% to 10%, prioritizing stability over profit. Espada constructs a temporary defensive wall, while the knights begin preparing a moat and traps. Van tests his production magic again, creating incredibly durable wooden blocks that cannot be damaged even by Ortho's sword. He continues producing weapons effortlessly and gifts Kamsin a sword, which Kamsin accepts with great gratitude. That night, Van notices everyone is exhausted from sleeping outdoors. Deciding that proper living conditions come first, he resolves to build a house. The next morning, Van analyzes the land and activates his production magic. In an instant, a massive mansion rises from the ground. Everyone is left completely speechless, as Van calmly wonders if he might have made it a little too big. And that's how Episode 2 comes to an end. Subscribe to Recap Sama for more anime recaps like this one. Villagers still struggling to believe what they just witnessed. Van's production magic has already transformed the village, and Till is clearly excited, while Kamsen points out that this kind of magic is actually more suitable for a feudal lord than the four elemental magics. Van finds this interesting, but he admits that he still prefers offensive magic because it allows him to directly protect his people. When he asks whether they wouldn't feel safer under a lord like that, both Till and Kamsen immediately disagree. They say they would rather live under Van than under his father any day, which makes Van happy, even though he knows they might be biased. Espada then gives his own opinion. He explains that during wartime, Van's thinking would be correct, since defense is everything. But in peaceful times, people want a lord who improves their daily lives. In that sense, no one understands the villagers better than Van. Everyone agrees that Van's production magic is not only powerful, but also kind. Van then casually tells everyone that if they bring wood, he can build houses for them too. This shocks the adventurers and knights, who immediately rush off to gather materials. Soon after, the villagers also ask if their homes can be rebuilt, since their current homes are old, leaky, and barely standing. Van realizes rebuilding everything at once will be exhausting, but after seeing their living conditions, he decides to renovate the entire village first. Before long, the village is completely transformed. Old houses are replaced with clean, sturdy new ones, arranged in neat blocks with proper roads between them. Van intentionally makes all the houses identical to avoid inequality. The villagers are deeply grateful and bring him gifts in return. Van even builds simple public baths next to his mansion, mostly because he wants to bathe himself, but everyone ends up loving them. Water and heat are supplied using magic, and while some awkward moments almost happen, Van keeps things respectful. That night, Van finally relaxes after a long day. That night, Lady Panamera travels in a carriage with Arit, a small girl. Panamera gently teases and comforts her as they head toward a remote village. Soon after, work continues on strengthening the village defenses. A moat is completed, and Van suggests filling it with water for both defense and daily use. Espada diverts water from a nearby river, while the knights and soldiers help dig and reinforce the structure. Thanks to teamwork, the entire project is finished far faster than expected. The villagers celebrate as clean water finally flows into the village. Van doesn't stop there. He later orders the construction of a large wall surrounding the village, using fused earth and stone to create something as strong as concrete. He also installs defensive crossbows along the walls. What was once a poor settlement has now become a small fortress that bandits could never breach. While discussing the future, Espada reminds Van that defense alone isn't enough. The village needs steady income. Merchants only visit once a month, and food resources are limited. They begin brainstorming ideas for export goods, but most options are rejected because only Van can produce them. Later, Van learns that nearby mountains contain valuable minerals like iron, silver, gold, and even rare materials. This raises the possibility of a dungeon nearby, which could completely change the village's future. However, they decide to wait until the village is more stable before announcing anything. Van continues helping adventurers by crafting high-quality weapons from refined materials, shocking everyone with the speed and precision of his magic production. Despite using massive amounts of mana, Van shows no signs of magical exhaustion, though he admits his body still gets physically tired. Just as things seem calm, an alarm rings out. Armored lizard monsters are approaching the village. Van immediately orders the gates closed and the bridge raised. Seeing the fear on everyone's faces, Van steps forward and speaks clearly. He tells them that this fight will be dangerous and they could get hurt, but he will fight alongside them. However, he can't protect the village alone, and he asks everyone to stand with him. The villagers listen closely, realizing that their young lord is ready to risk his life for them. Van standing before the villagers as danger approaches, he tells everyone that he's ready to fight, but he cannot protect the village alone. He asks the villagers to lend him their strength so they can defend their home together. Moved by his words, the villagers agree and rush to the walls, preparing the defenses. Van learns that Ortho's party is away hunting, so someone must take command on the wall. When Till grabs Van's arm in fear, he decides to stay behind and issue orders from below. He sends Dee to the ramparts to report the situation in real time. As soon as Dee reaches the wall, he's shocked to see around 40 armored lizards marching toward the village. Each monster is nearly 8 meters tall, and even veteran knights struggle to defeat just one. Following Van's orders, Dee commands the villagers to load iron bolts into the ballistae. Although everyone doubts the weapons will work, Dee decides to trust Van. When they fire, the bolts punch straight through the lizards, dropping 10 of them instantly. The villagers cheer, but the joy is long-lived as they realize they only have one iron bolt left per ballista. They fire a second volley and take down more monsters, but half of the lizards are still standing and they are now out of iron bolts. As panic spreads, Van quickly thinks of another option. He remembers how a wooden sword once cut through powerful defenses and tells Dee to use wooden bolts instead. The knights protest, but Dee silences them and once again trusts Van's judgment. The wooden bolts pierce into the lizards' bodies, getting stuck halfway, but that is enough to destroy their vital organs. Realizing they can still fight, Dee orders everyone to keep firing. The remaining armored lizards are wiped out completely, and the village wins without a single injury. Dee reports the victory to Van, and the villagers celebrate loudly, amazed that even wooden weapons worked. After the battle, Ortho's party returns and helps process the lizard corpses. They collect valuable materials like eyes, fangs, skins, and magic cores, while the meat is prepared for food. Thanks to Van's specially made knives, the work goes much faster than usual. Seeing the massive amount of meat, Van declares that the village will hold a grand feast. That night, everyone celebrates, eating and drinking together. Ortho's party praises the weapons Van made for them, and the knights grow jealous, asking Van to craft weapons for them as well. Van politely refuses payment and promises to help once the village's affairs are settled. Ortho explains that each armored lizard can sell for a good amount of gold, but Van is shocked to learn that half of their earnings must be paid as tax once they exceed a certain amount. Even worse, if his father learns how valuable the village has become, Van may be exiled again. Espada suggests reporting the victory under Van's older brother's name, allowing them to stay under the radar. Van agrees, relieved. The next day, 2 merchants arrive and are stunned by the fortress-like village and the massive stock of monster materials. Van sells them the goods and even gives them meat for free before it spoils. He also shows them his weapons, which impress the merchants so much that they agree to sell them at full price. Instead of letting them monopolize the trade, Van suggests they open a shop directly in the village, and he builds it instantly, leaving them speechless. Soon after, Van receives unexpected visitors from a neighboring county, a noble girl named Arte and her guardian, Panamera, a powerful knight who has risen to Viscountess. Panamera bluntly states that she is here to judge whether Van is truly a genius or a threat. Van calmly explains his situation, claiming he was exiled and has no interest in war. Panamera doubts him, suspecting a hidden military force, but Van clears the misunderstanding with help from Dee, Espada, and Till, each explaining why they chose to stay with him. To prove the truth, Van demonstrates his production magic by instantly transforming a simple earthen wall into a fortress-grade structure. Panamera and Arte are stunned when they learn this so-called useless magic is the reason Van was exiled. Then Panamera reveals her true mission, offering Arte's hand in marriage to Van to prevent future conflict. Van gently refuses, saying he only wants a peaceful life. After witnessing his character and ability, Panamera changes her mind and openly supports the idea of marriage, even praising Van's intelligence and leadership. Arte, however, shyly admits she is not ready for such a decision yet, and Van agrees to give her time. The guests decide to stay the night, forcing Van to quickly build an inn for them to dinner. During dinner, Van and Arte talk quietly, discovering shared interests, and Arte begins to feel comfortable around him. Later, Arte thanks Van for his kindness and admits she feels relieved after meeting him. Van, realizing that Arte may share a past similar to his own, he decides that regardless of marriage, he will let her stay in the village if she wishes and live freely on her own terms. Early in the morning, Van is suddenly awakened by Till and Kamseen. They tell him something urgent is happening at the lake he created behind the village. Van is still half asleep and clearly not happy about getting up so early, but after hearing that Dee and Espada are already there, he decides to go. When Van arrives, he sees villagers gathered around the lake. As he moves closer, he is shocked to see a strange girl floating in the water. She looks like a mermaid, with her upper body above the surface. Espada explains that she is an apkaloo, a rare half-human, half-fish species that people almost never encounter. Van wonders why such a rare being has appeared in his village. Van tries talking to her, but she doesn't respond at first. Thinking quickly, he decides that offering food might be a good way to show friendliness. He gives her some meat, and that immediately works. She swims over, happily asks if she can eat it, and quickly realizes it is armored lizard meat. Curious, she asks who defeated such dangerous monsters. Before Van can downplay it, the villagers proudly declare that Van was the one who did it. After hearing this, the apkaloo suddenly dives back into the lake and disappears. Van assumes that was the end of it, but the very next day, things escalate. A large group of apkaloo appear at the lake, and one intimidating man steps forward. He introduces himself as Latavesta, the leader of the apkaloo, and reveals that the girl from yesterday is his daughter, Lata Priora. Confirming that Van really defeated the armored lizards, Latavesta shocks everyone by offering Priora's hand in marriage to Van. Van is completely stunned. Priora is clearly still a child, and Van calmly asks why such a proposal is being made. Latavesta explains that armored lizards have been attacking their people for years, and he wants to form an alliance with a powerful human lord to protect his tribe. Realizing this is not about feelings but survival, Van gently refuses the marriage. Instead, he promises to protect the apkaloo without any conditions. Surprised by Van's kindness, Latavesta agrees to move his people closer to the village for safety. Van immediately builds a large resting area for them using his production magic. The apkaloo are amazed by how quickly and efficiently he constructs it. Later, when it's time to flush the village sewage system, Van explains his underground pipe system. The apkaloo offer to handle this task regularly since they're skilled with water, and Van happily accepts their help. Things get awkward again when Arte and Panamera arrive and hear Latavesta calling Van his son-in-law. Before Van can explain, Priora suddenly pops out of the water and proudly calls Van her husband, then swims away. To clear the misunderstanding, Van takes Arte on a calm boat ride and explains everything. Arte finally understands and feels relieved. However, peace doesn't last long. Priora becomes jealous when she sees Van alone with Arte, and the other apkaloo start rocking the boat in protest. Later, Latavesta confronts Van and accuses him of flirting. To settle things, he proposes a competition. If the apkaloo win, Van must officially accept the engagement. Dee immediately accepts the challenge on Van's behalf, leaving Van no way out. The competition has 3 rounds. The first is volleyball, a game Van introduces. Despite Till and Panamera's efforts, the apkaloo dominate and win the first round easily. The second round is a swimming relay, which seems completely unfair since the apkaloo are natural swimmers. Kamseen and Dee step up, and surprisingly, Dee's powerful butterfly stroke secures them a dramatic victory. For the final round, Van creates an ice maker and announces a shaved ice speed-eating contest. Van and Arte team up, enduring painful brain freezes but pushing through with determination. In the end, they win the final round, securing overall victory. Even after losing, Latavesta continues calling Van his son-in-law, leaving Van frustrated. As everyone celebrates, Arte reflects on her painful past, being neglected, rejected for her marionette magic, and feeling like a failure. Watching Van lead with kindness and confidence inspires her to try harder and believe in herself. Then, Van announcing plans to expand the village defenses and reward everyone with a big barbecue. Arte asks if she can watch Van work, hoping to learn from him. Far away in the forest, unseen danger begins to stir, hinting at the next threat approaching the village. Back at the village, where everyone is admiring the newly completed ramparts, the walls are tall, solid, and incredibly sturdy, and the villagers are amazed that Van managed to finish them in just 2 weeks. Panamera is clearly impressed and admits that even though she knew Van was capable, she never imagined he could accomplish something on this level. Van explains that as more merchants and adventurers move in, they will need to build many more houses. Hearing this, Panamera admits she feels a little jealous. Ever since childhood, she dreamed of owning land of her own, and seeing Van manage an entire territory makes her want to earn her own place someday through merit, not money. Panamera then notices the large weapons mounted on the ramparts and asks what they are. Van explains that they are upgraded ballistae that he crafted himself. These versions can fire 2 bolts in quick succession. To demonstrate their power, Van asks Compson to test-fire one. The bolt launches with tremendous force, proving just how deadly the weapon is. When Panamera learns that Van has built over 100 of these ballistae, she is completely shocked and immediately offers to buy one. Van refuses, saying they are not for sale. Not giving up, Panamera offers to owe Van a favor in exchange for one ballista. Van agrees, saying he will collect that favor in the future. As they discuss transportation and ammunition, Compson suggests that Panamera also take some of Van's special bolts. To demonstrate their quality, he shows her a sword made by Van and effortlessly slices through another sword. Panamera is stunned to learn that the weapon is made of ordinary iron, yet strong enough to pierce armored lizards. Impressed, she asks for both the ballista and the special bolts, and Van agrees. Suddenly, Ortho and his party come running out of the forest in panic. They warn everyone that a massive forest dragon is chasing them. Ortho shouts for the villagers to run back inside the walls while his group acts as decoys. Van hesitates, knowing that leaving Ortho behind would be extremely dangerous, but fighting outside could also put the village at risk. Panamera steps forward calmly and declares that she will help fight the dragon. She orders everyone to move behind the ramparts and prepares the ballistae. Van apologizes to Arte for exposing her to such danger, but reassures her that they are prepared. He orders Till to escort Arte to safety and summon D and the soldiers. As the forest dragon approaches, Van orders the ballistae to fire at its wings. The first volley struggles, forcing Panamera to step in. She unleashes powerful fire magic, revealing herself to be a top-class elemental mage. Her fire javelin strikes the dragon directly, but even that is not enough to bring it down. The ballistae fire again, and this time some bolts manage to pierce the dragon's wings. However, the dragon quickly adapts and begins dodging the attacks. Ortho's party barely makes it back behind the walls, but Van knows they need more time to retreat safely. Panamera fires another fire javelin, briefly slowing the dragon. This gives everyone the chance to fall back toward the village. Just when it seems they might escape, the dragon recovers far too quickly. At that moment, Esparta steps forward and calmly restrains the dragon using earth magic, buying precious time for everyone else to retreat. Back at the village gates, Van decides to call in the favor Panamera owes him. He explains his plan. Panamera will pin the dragon in place with her magic, and the ballistae will finish it off. Panamera agrees without hesitation. When the dragon arrives again, the ballistae are still being prepared. To delay it, D and his men charge forward using the high-grade weapons Van made for them. Though they cannot defeat the dragon, they successfully buy enough time to complete preparations. At the perfect moment, Panamera unleashes her magic and pins the dragon down. The ballistae fire all at once, striking the dragon directly and dealing massive damage. D approaches carefully, and when the dragon shows signs of movement, he swiftly beheads it in a single strike. The forest dragon is finally defeated. The village erupts in celebration. Arte rushes to Van, relieved that he is unharmed. Panamera praises Van for his leadership and planning, admitting that no ordinary village could have survived such an attack. A dragon-slaying ceremony is held to honor those who fought bravely. D is awarded the title of Dragon Slayer for delivering the final blow. Esparta is honored for his magic, and Van is praised for his intelligence, leadership, and for transforming the village into a fortress in such a short time. As Panamera reflects on her past, she realizes that Van is unlike any noble she has ever met. She sees how Arte has grown more confident since meeting him and recognizes Van as a truly refreshing presence. Finally, Panamera makes a bold announcement. As Viscountess Panamera Carrera Cayenne, she declares an equal alliance with Van. Surprised, Van understands the value of this offer. With few noble connections left, this alliance could secure the village's future. After a moment of thought, Van accepts. And with that, a powerful alliance is formed. After defeating the forest dragon without any casualties, Van and Esparta talk about the future of the village. Esparta suggests that now is the right time to begin city planning. His goal is to turn the settlement into a city that can support around 10,000 people, but to do that, they will first need to attract new residents. Soon after, Belle and Rango return with merchants from the Merry Chamber of Commerce who are interested in buying the forest dragon materials. After inspecting the dragon, the merchants say it should be worth around 100 platinum. Van realizes that this amount equals an unbelievable fortune. However, when the deal is discussed, the merchants suddenly lower their offer to only 60 platinum. Belle and Rango strongly disagree with this unfair pricing and refuse to cheat Van. Angered by their honesty, the merchants threaten them and leave. Even though this means Belle and Rango will be expelled from their merchant group, they stand by their decision. Seeing this, Van suggests that they start their own trading company instead. To found a trading company, they need 3 things: a guild registration fee, a physical shop, and an endorsement from a titled noble. Van asks Lady Panamera for help, and she immediately agrees. She believes supporting honest merchants will improve her reputation as a noble. Then, Van suggests that Panamera take credit for slaying the dragon to boost her status, but she explains that investigations would eventually expose the truth. Instead, she advises Van to accept the achievement himself and obtain a noble title. Since he is the son of a marquis, she believes he can be granted the rank of baron. Although Van worries about standing out too much, Panamera reassures him and agrees to let him take full credit for defeating the dragon. With her endorsement secured, Belle and Rango offer Van 130 platinum for the dragon materials as a show of gratitude. When they realize they have no carriage to transport the goods, Panamera lends them her powerful warhorse, allowing them to proceed without relying on the Merry Chamber of Commerce. The former merchants are left shocked when they realize Belle and Rango now have noble backing. Later, Panamera visits King Dino and formally requests a title for Van. At first, the king doubts that an 8-year-old could rule a village properly. However, after hearing Van's achievements and seeing proof of the slain dragon, he becomes convinced. Van is officially granted the title of Baron, and the news spreads quickly throughout the kingdom. Back in the village, Van continues developing the settlement. He rebuilds houses, improves infrastructure, and constructs tall watchtowers for defense. As the village grows more organized, the people begin calling it Van Town. During lunch, Arte asks Van to call her by her first name, showing how much more comfortable she has become. Later, villagers from a neighboring domain arrive, explaining that their home has been drained of young workers and they can no longer survive. Despite the political risk, Van decides to accept all 300 of them and promise to provide homes and work. The new villagers are welcomed with a large barbecue and dessert made from fresh milk. Van reassures them that there will be jobs in farming, shops, and construction. For the first time in a long while, the refugees feel hope. Esparta reminds Van that while the village has grown, it still has a long way to go before becoming a true city. Van accepts the challenge and vows to continue working towards building a city where everyone can live peacefully. After finishing their daily work, Lord Van is immediately told to begin his studies, showing once again how strict his routine is. Soon after, Kusala and the others return and admit they accidentally discovered the entrance to a dungeon while hunting. Since dungeon discoveries must be reported, Van orders a messenger to inform the royal capital. Kusala is sent alone to deliver the report and is rewarded with a mithril short sword for his efforts. While traveling, Kusala easily defeats monsters that once would have been difficult for him. Along the way, he rescues a young noblewoman named Flameria from danger. She explains that her father, a baron, died in battle and their land was taken, forcing her to seek work in the royal capital. Kusala invites her to come live in Van's village instead, promising to protect her. After Kusala returns and submits the report, large numbers of adventurers begin gathering near the village due to the dungeon. To prevent chaos, Van decides to build a separate outpost near the dungeon for adventurers and assigns Esparta as its governor, while also forming a new chivalric order to maintain order. Van personally travels to the dungeon area and criticizes the adventurers for their reckless behavior near a dangerous crevice. Prioritizing safety, he constructs a sturdy bridge, seals the dungeon entrance, and builds a large, well-organized base with rest areas, food facilities, sleeping quarters, and water systems so adventurers can operate safely. The adventurers are stunned by how much Van accomplishes despite his young age. Before leaving due to Van's strict sunset curfew, Arte discovers mithril ore near the dungeon site, suggesting future development opportunities. However, Van being summoned by Esparta for a serious discussion, hinting at incoming trouble. The next day, peaceful view of Van's village, Arte admires how beautiful it has become, and Van reminds her that all their hard work finally paid off. He gently asks Arte what she truly wants for herself, not what others expect of her. After hesitating, Arte quietly admits that she wants to be engaged to Lord Van, leaving him clearly flustered and unusually happy. Soon after, Bell and Rango return from the royal capital. They report that the trading company was successfully established and hand over 30 platinum coins. Van calmly accepts the money, but his excitement truly explodes when they present a machine bow, a new weapon capable of firing multiple bolts in succession. Van is far more thrilled by the weapon than the fortune, already thinking about improving the village's defenses. The conversation shifts to Lady Panamera, who is currently reporting to Count Ferdinando. Although she will not live in the village, she plans to obtain land nearby, clearly intending to stay close to Van. It is strongly hinted that she has ambitions far greater than most nobles. Later, Van notices Arte feeling insecure after a small mistake and reassures her. When he asks about her magical aptitude, Arte hesitantly reveals that she possesses marionette magic, an ability commonly despised and feared by nobles. Instead of rejecting it, Van is genuinely fascinated and encourages her to show him. Arte demonstrates her magic by moving a puppet, astonishing everyone. Van immediately recognizes its potential and praises her talent without hesitation. Encouraged by Van's words, Arte agrees to perform a public show. The villagers gather, unsure and even fearful at first due to the dark reputation of marionette magic. Van openly addresses their concerns and allows Arte to begin. The puppet performs a graceful dance, moving as if it were alive. The crowd slowly shifts from fear to awe, then erupts in applause. Arte, overwhelmed but happy, finally feels accepted, realizing that her magic can bring joy to others. The next day, a royal carriage arrives at the village, carrying Lady Panamera and the king himself. Van formally meets King Dino and Sora Belrenet, who announces that Van has officially become a baron. The king also questions Van about the dungeon discovery and the forest dragon he defeated, warning him not to lie. Van gives the king a full tour of the village, explaining the star-shaped fortress, ballistae, and defensive design. The king and his chancellor are shocked to learn that Van personally designed and built everything in only a few months. Then, Van demonstrates his production magic, effortlessly constructing massive stone walls, leaving the royal party speechless. At the lake, they encounter Lada Vesta, chieftain of the Lada tribe, who gifts the king rare orichalcum as a sign of friendship. Van casually forges the legendary metal into a sword on the spot, pushing the king's disbelief to its limit. When questioned, Van makes one request in exchange for his honesty: permanent residence in his land so he can continue protecting and developing it. The king agrees. Just as the visit seems to conclude, an emergency alarm sounds. A dragon is approaching the village. Van immediately orders everyone to defensive positions.
Panamera notices that a mage is controlling it. Chancellor Aperta explains that wyverns normally travel in groups, so if one is attacking alone, other enemies are likely nearby. He suspects the kingdom of Yelanetta is behind it. Van realizes the wyvern is flying too high for the ballistae to reach, so he decides to deploy his prototype weapon. Meanwhile, Prince Unamog of Yeleneta arrives with a group of elite knights to invade the village. He believes conquering the small settlement will be easy. However, when they arrive, they are shocked to see a massive fortress city instead of a simple village. Unamog refuses to believe the fortress is real and orders his knights to break the gate. Even with several attempts, the knights can barely damage it. At that moment, Van appears on the ramparts and calmly introduces himself as the lord of the village. Unamog threatens to attack with his wyvern and orders the mage to begin the assault. In response, Van asks Panamera to fire the prototype weapon. The weapon releases thousands of small shuriken from a bomb, instantly shooting down the wyvern in the sky. Seeing this overwhelming power, the Yeleneta knights immediately surrender. Prince Unamog is captured and interrogated. Under pressure, he reveals that the attack on the village was only a distraction. Their real target is the fortress city of Skudet. After hearing this, the king decides to return to the capital to organize the kingdom's defense. Before leaving, he asks Van to join them in protecting Skudet. Van hesitates because he does not want to abandon his village, but he eventually agrees after being reminded that defending the nation is a noble's duty. Van prepares his forces for the mission. Esparta stays behind to protect the village, while Dee, Till, Kamsin, and several adventurers join Van. Arte also decides to bring her powerful mithril marionette to help in battle. Meanwhile, Jalpa, Van's father, arrives near Skudet and is shocked to see the city's defenses destroyed by Yeleneta's wyvern forces. At the battlefield, Arte uses her mithril marionette to destroy several wyverns, while Van and his allies fight to support the Scuderia knights. Van realizes their real goal is to buy time for the retreating army, so they continue fighting until enough time has passed. Even though they might have a chance to win, Van orders everyone to retreat because his priority is making sure his allies return home safely. Later, Van reflects on how terrible war can be. Instead of continuing to fight directly, he decides to support the war effort by creating new weapons. He begins designing powerful catapults that can be used on the battlefield. Van feels uneasy about heading back to the battlefield, but still moves towards Skudet. On the way, he meets his father, Jalpa, who is shocked to hear that Van defeated a dragon using ballistae, though he refuses to believe it. At the royal meeting, they discuss retaking Skudet from Yeleneta, whose army uses wyverns and powerful new weapons. While others doubt him, Van proposes taking down the wyverns quickly. He refuses to fight on the front lines, choosing to support from behind to protect his village. Though criticized, he promises to provide powerful weapons and instantly creates ballistae and catapults using magic. As the battle begins, Van's strategy is put into action. While the army splits and attacks, his team focuses on defending and using artillery. When Yeleneta deploys wyverns, Van's special catapults successfully shoot them down. The remaining wyvern is defeated through teamwork. With their main force gone, the enemy is defeated, and their commander is captured. He reveals that this was part of a three-pronged attack, with the final target being Ferdinato County, Arte's homeland. Arte learns that her homeland, Ferdinato County, is the final target of Yeleneta's three-pronged attack. Without hesitation, she asks Van to let her go. Van offers to go with her, but Arte refuses, saying this is her family's responsibility. Van understands that if he interferes, it could damage her family's status, so he lets her go, sending Ortho and the adventurers to protect her. When Arte arrives, her homeland is already under attack. Wyverns rain down destructive black bombs, and the city is in chaos. Despite her fear, Arte decides to fight and protect her home. Using her powerful marionette magic, she controls a silver knight that quickly destroys the enemy wyverns. However, the enemy sends even more reinforcements, including around 50 wyverns. Even while overwhelmed and doubting herself, Arte keeps fighting. She pushes past her fears and uses 2 marionettes at once, unleashing her full power. Remembering how Van gave her confidence, she finally accepts her strength and defeats all the wyverns, forcing the enemy army to retreat. Even after saving her homeland, Arte chooses not to meet her family, believing she would only cause trouble. Instead, she returns to Van. Feeling insecure about her leadership, she admits her weakness, but Van reassures her and praises her efforts.
Finally, she regains her confidence and smiles again. Back in the village, Van continues improving the town, turning it into a lively and happy place. Everyone celebrates together, enjoying food and peace after the battle. Van reflects on how this small village has become his true home, filled with people he cares about. But his peaceful moment doesn't last long as his mentors start arguing about his training. Not wanting to deal with it, Van runs away while everyone laughs at the chaos. That was Season 1 of Easygoing Territory Defense by the Optimistic Lord. Subscribe for more anime recaps like this one.